The stew was warm, the house was dark, and Elias Whitmore knew no living soul had permission to be in his kitchen. He stopped on the porch with one boot still in the dust, rain ticking soft against the brim of his hat, his gloved hand resting on the latch like the door itself had turned into a warning. For 7 years, that cabin had greeted him with cold ash, dry boards, and the kind of silence a man earns when he outlives the only voice that ever called him home. But that night, smoke curled from the stovepipe in a thin gray ribbon, and through the cracks around the door came the smell of beef, wild onions, potatoes, sage, and black pepper. Too much black pepper. Elias did not move. Somewhere behind him, his horse snorted and stamped in the mud, but even that sound felt far away. The smell had reached into him like a hand through time. It was not just supper. It was winter in another year. It was Mary laughing by the stove, telling him a man who worked cattle all day ought to taste his food before the wind stole it. It was a blue dress brushing against the table leg. It was a wooden spoon tapping the rim of an iron pot. Then the memory broke, and the present stood there cold as a rifle barrel. No one knew that recipe. No one alive. Elias pushed the door open slow. The hinges complained. Firelight breathed across the room, touching the walls, the empty chair, the tin cups, the old shelf where Mary used to keep salt in a cracked blue jar. The kettle hissed. The stew rolled gentle in the black pot. And beside the stove stood an Apache woman. She did not jump when he entered. She did not reach for a knife or hide her hands. She stood straight, rain-dark hair falling over one shoulder, a plain blanket around her dress. Her face lit gold on one side by the stove and shadowed on the other by the room. She looked tired, but not afraid enough. That troubled him most. Elias drew his revolver, not fast, not wild, just enough for the metal to catch the firelight. "Who made this stew?" he asked. His voice was low, rough from 3 days of dust and no company but cattle. The woman's eyes moved from the gun to his face. They were dark, steady, and older than her years. In her right hand she held a wooden spoon, its bowl stained with broth, its handle burned black at the end. Elias saw that burn mark and felt the room tilt a half-inch under his boots. The spoon had a scar, same as memory. Same as the night his home stopped being a home. "I did," she said. Her English was careful, quiet, shaped by a tongue that had learned more than one world and trusted neither. Elias took one step inside. Rain tapped behind him. The fire snapped once. "You got no business in this house." The woman lowered the spoon, but did not set it down. "No," she said. "I do not." That answer sat between them stranger than any lie. Elias looked at the stew again. The potatoes were cut thick, the way Mary had cut them because she said thin ones turned cowardly in a pot. The onions had been browned first. The sage tied with twine. Small things. Impossible things. His mouth went dry. "Where'd you learn to cook that?" he asked. The woman looked toward the empty chair at the table, and for the first time, something like sorrow crossed her face. Not guilt. Not fear. Sorrow. "A dead woman taught my mother," she said. The words moved through the cabin without raising their voice, yet they struck harder than thunder. Elias forgot the rain, forgot the gun in his hand, forgot even to breathe. Outside, the wind dragged dust and water across the yard, but inside that kitchen, the stew kept simmering like it had waited 7 long years for him to come home. Elias kept the revolver low, but his finger eased away from the trigger. A man could learn a great deal from the way a stranger stood in his house. Thieves watched windows. Liars watched hands. Desperate people watched doors. This woman watched the room like she was listening to it breathe. Her gaze moved from the stove to the salt jar, from the cracked blue jar to the nail where Mary's apron used to hang, then back to Elias, as if every inch of that kitchen had already been described to her by someone who loved it. "Name," Elias said. The word came out flat. The woman set the spoon across the pot with careful respect, not clattering it, not dropping it. "Naelli Dossela." Outside, thunder rolled far off beyond the mesa, low and tired. Elias had heard that family name once or twice in trading posts, spoken with caution by men who knew more stories than truth. "Apache, Dossela, hills west of the dry creek." "You alone?" he asked. "Tonight." That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters. He studied her coat, if it could be called that. A wool blanket, dark from rain, pinned at one shoulder. Mud on the hem of her dress. A scratch across one knuckle. No rifle. No saddlebag on the floor. No pack near the door. Either she had come in a hurry, or she had come believing she would not be staying long. Elias took another step, boots loud on boards that had not heard company in years. Naelli did not move back. That bothered him. Not because it was brave, because it was familiar. Mary had stood that way when she knew she was right, and the whole territory could go hang for disagreeing. You broke in, he said. The back latch was loose. That does not make it yours to open. No, again, no excuse. No begging. Just the truth, stripped down to bone. Elias looked past her to the counter. His flour tin was open. His onions were peeled. His last piece of salted beef had been cut clean, not hacked. The knife lay washed beside the basin. Even the towel was folded the way Mary used to fold it, corner under corner, because she said a messy towel made a poor welcome. That small thing sent a colder feeling through him than the rain. Who told you where things were? He asked. Naelli's eyes lowered for half a breath. My mother. Your mother has been in my house. No, then how? She touched the burned end of the spoon with 2 fingers, gentle as if touching a sleeping child's forehead. She listened to someone who had. Elias swallowed hard and hated that she saw it. The cabin seemed smaller now, crowded by ghosts and unasked questions. 7 years ago, after the fire, folks in Mercy Ridge had told him there was nothing left worth remembering. They had handed him a box of ash-dark scraps and spoken softly, the way people speak when they want grief to stay polite. No one mentioned a spoon. No one mentioned a woman carried out alive. No one mentioned Apache hands trying to save what white neighbors had already given up for lost. You expect me to believe a dead woman gave your mother a recipe? Elias asked. Naelli looked at the stew, and steam curled between them like breath in winter. No, she said. I expect you to taste it and remember whether I am lying. The answer cut too clean. Elias glanced at the pot, and the hunger in him was not for food. It was for one ordinary evening before the world burned crooked. But he did not move toward the bowl. Not yet. Through the rain, a faint sound reached the cabin. Hooves in wet dirt. More than one horse. Naelli heard it too. Her shoulders tightened, just a little. Elias turned toward the window. Lantern light flickered on the glass, and beyond it, far down the road from Mercy Ridge, 3 riders were coming through the dark. The riders stopped short of the porch, and for a moment no one came down. Elias could see them through the rain-streaked window, 3 dark shapes under hat brims, their horses breathing white in the cold. The middle rider carried a lantern, and the light swung against his coat buttons, bright, dull, bright again. Silas Crowley always liked arriving with a little theater. He owned the general store in Mercy Ridge, held notes on half the ranches within 30 miles, and smiled like a man who charged interest on kindness. Elias had not invited him. That had never stopped Silas before. A fist struck the front door twice. Not hard. Familiar. Like the man already owned the wood. Whitmore, Silas called. Saw smoke from the ridge. Figured you had finally remembered how to keep a house warm. Elias did not answer. Naelli stood near the stove, still as a shadow cast by firelight. The stew simmered softly behind her. Its smell had filled the cabin now, rich and impossible, wrapping itself around every old wound Elias had kept shut. Another knock. Open up, Elias. Sheriff Pike is with me. Elias looked at Naelli. Stay behind me. Her chin lifted slightly. I am not hiding. You will if you know what Mercy Ridge does with a story before it knows the truth. That made her eyes shift, not in fear, but in recognition. She knew towns. She knew men who gathered first and listened later. Elias opened the door only halfway. Rain pushed in. Silas Crowley stood on the step with his hat shining wet, his mustache neat, his smile too warm for the weather. Behind him, Sheriff Abel Pike waited under a slicker, thin and nervous, with Deputy Harlan Moss beside him holding the lantern. Silas smelled the air before he spoke. His smile faded just a little. Well now, he said. That smells like supper. Elias kept his shoulder in the doorway. Road is open behind you. Silas leaned enough to see past him. His eyes found the stove. Then Naelli. The change in him was small, but Elias caught it. Surprise first. Then calculation. Then pleasure, mean and quiet, settling behind his eyes. Sheriff, Silas said softly. I believe Mr. Whitmore has company. Pike stepped closer, squinting into the cabin. When he saw Naelli, his mouth tightened as if he had tasted dust. Evening, ma'am, he said, because he was not cruel by nature. only weak when Cruelty stood near him wearing a clean coat. Silas removed his gloves finger by finger. An Apache woman in your kitchen after dark, Elias. That is a curious arrangement. The deputy glanced at the stew, then at Naelli's blanket, then away. Men like Harlan Moss were brave only in groups and honest only when honesty cost nothing. Elias felt Naelli move behind him, not back, just enough to stand in the open. Firelight touched the burned spoon in her hand. Silas noticed it. His face went still for less than a heartbeat. Too fast for Pike. Not for Elias. She came out of the rain, Elias said. That is all. Silas gave a soft laugh. Folks in town might not hear it that simple. A stranger slips into a widower's cabin, cooks from his stores, handles his things. Some would call that trespass. Some might wonder what else she came to take. Naelli spoke then, quiet but clear. I took nothing. Silas turned his smile on her. No offense meant, miss. But around here, taking is not always done with hands. The room cooled. Elias opened the door wider and stepped onto the threshold, placing himself between Silas and the kitchen. Rain ran from his hat brim. Choose your next words careful. Pike shifted his feet. Elias, no need for this to sour. But it already had. The stew kept breathing warmth into the cabin while the men outside brought the cold with them. Silas looked past Elias again, toward the spoon, toward the pot, toward a secret he had not expected to smell after 7 years. Then he smiled. Maybe we ought to all come in, he said. A man should know who is feeding him. Elias did not let them cross the threshold. The doorway stayed narrow, his body filling most of it, the rain sliding off his coat in dark lines. Silas Crowley looked at that barrier and smiled as if it amused him, but his eyes kept drifting toward the stove, toward the burned spoon, toward Naelli standing in the amber wash of firelight. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat. Maybe best we step inside and ask a few plain questions. You can ask from there, Elias said. Pike looked relieved not to enter. Silas did not. You always were stubborn about hospitality, Silas said. Mary used to have better manners. The name landed in the room like a dropped plate. Elias went very still. Behind him, the stew gave one soft bubble, then another. Naelli's fingers tightened around the spoon, and Silas saw it. He saw too much. Do not speak her name on my porch, Elias said. The warning was quiet. That made it heavier. Silas lifted both hands, all innocence and rainwater. No disrespect. Only saying this house once had a civilized table. Now I find an Apache woman stirring a pot in the dead of night with your door shut. Deputy Harlan shifted beside the sheriff. He wanted the story to be simple. Most men did. Simple stories let them sleep. Naelli stepped forward before Elias could stop her. She was not tall, but the room seemed to move around her when she spoke. Your fear is too hungry, Mr. Crowley. It eats before it knows the meal. Pike blinked. Harlan frowned. Silas stopped smiling with his mouth, but not with his eyes. She knows my name, he said. Interesting. Everybody knows the man who owns the debt, Elias replied. Not everybody knows the smell of my kitchen. Silas let that sit, then pointed his chin toward the spoon. Where did she get that? Elias turned halfway. Naelli looked down at the burned handle, and the fire showed 2 faint carved letters near her thumb. M.W. Not clear. Not new. But there. Elias had seen them once before, though his mind had buried the memory under ash and whiskey and 7 empty winters. Mary had carved them herself with a sewing needle because she said no husband of hers would mistake her good spoon for kindling. Elias reached back without looking. Give it here. Naelli hesitated. Only a breath. Then she placed it in his hand. The wood was warm from stew, light as bone, heavy as a coffin nail. His thumb moved over the carved letters, and something in him sank. Where did you get this? He asked. Naelli answered him. Not the men outside. My mother carried it from the fire. Elias looked at her then. Really looked. Rain drummed above them. Pike's lantern hissed in the wet. What fire? Silas asked too quickly. No one had spoken to him. That was how Elias knew. Naelli's eyes remained on Elias. The night your wife's house burned. My mother found her beyond the smoke, near the wash behind the barn. She was alive. The word alive moved through the cabin like a lamp being uncovered. Elias heard Pike breathe in. He heard Harlan whisper something under his breath. Silas gave a short laugh, but it came out dry. That is a grave thing to claim with no proof, but a kitchen tool. Naelli turned the spoon in Elias's hand, So the burned end faced Silas. Then why did you ask about it before he did? Silence came down hard. Even the rain seemed to hold itself against the roof. Elias looked from Naelli to Silas, and for the first time in 7 years, the story Mercy Ridge had handed him began to crack at the edges. Elias did not invite them in. He stepped back because the truth had walked into the doorway, and a man either makes room for it or spends the rest of his life pretending he cannot hear it knock. Silas crossed first, brushing rain from his sleeves as if the cabin already belonged to him. Sheriff Pike followed with his hat in both hands. Deputy Harlan stayed near the door, lantern held high, eyes moving from Naelli to the stew to the spoon in Elias's hand. The room felt smaller with all of them inside. Too many boots. Too much wet wool. Too many breaths crowding a place that had lived on silence for 7 years. Naelli stood by the stove, her face calm, though Elias saw the strain in the set of her shoulders. She was not afraid of the men. She was afraid the truth would be handled carelessly. Silas pointed at the pot. If she expects us to swallow this tale, perhaps she can start with supper. His smile returned, thin and polished. A woman who sneaks into a man's kitchen ought to prove she has not poisoned what she touched. Pike looked uncomfortable. Silas, that is not called for. Is it not? Silas said. Then let Elias eat. If he trusts her story, let him trust her cooking. The challenge settled over the table. Elias looked at the bowl hanging on the wall peg. Mary's old bowl. White enamel with a blue rim, chipped near the edge from the time he had dropped it laughing over nothing important. He had not used it since the fire. He had told himself it was out of respect. Truth was, some objects remember too well. Naelli reached for the ladle. You do not have to. Elias held out the bowl. Fill it. She did. Slowly. Steam rose between them, carrying pepper, sage, beef, onion, and the ache of a life that had once been ordinary. Elias took the spoon, not the burned one, but a tin one from the drawer. He knew where Mary had kept it. So did Naelli. That knowledge sat in the room with them, patient as judgment. He lifted the stew to his mouth. The first taste nearly took the strength from his knees. It was not perfect. It was worse than perfect. It was close. The beef had cooked a little long. Mary used to do that when she was worried. The pepper was too heavy because he had once told her he liked it that way, and she had laughed for 3 winters after, calling him a liar with a brave tongue. The sage was tied, not loose. The potatoes were thick. The onions brown dark. Every small thing came back carrying light. Elias lowered the spoon. His hand shook once, then stilled. Nobody spoke. Naelli's voice came soft from beside the stove. She told my mother you would deny the pepper. She said you always did. Elias shut his eyes. He could hear Mary in that. Not as a ghost. As a person. Real, stubborn, warm-handed, standing in the place grief had tried to empty. Silas cleared his throat. Any woman can learn a recipe. Elias opened his eyes. The room had changed. Not for the others, maybe, but for him. The cabin was no longer only a grave for what he had lost. It had become witness. No, Elias said. Not this one. Silas's jaw tightened. Pike looked at Elias like he had just watched a locked door open. Naelli reached into the fold of her blanket and drew out a small round object wrapped in faded cloth. She placed it on the table beside the bowl. A silver store token, blackened at one edge, stamped with the mark of Crowley Mercantile. My mother found this near the barn, she said, where the fire began. Silas did not move, but the color left his face in a slow and telling way. Outside, thunder rolled beyond the hills. Inside, Elias looked down at the token, then at the man who had come in smiling, and understood that some fires burn for years before anyone sees who struck the match. The store token lay on the table like a coal that had forgotten how to cool. Elias did not touch it. Sheriff Pike leaned closer, lantern light trembling over the stamped letters of Crowley Mercantile. Deputy Harlan swallowed hard near the door. Silas Crowley looked at the token, then at Naelli, and for the first time that evening his polished face showed a crack. A trinket, Silas said. A burned trinket from my store proves nothing. Half this valley has carried those tokens. Not half this valley was seen near my barn that night, Elias said. Silas turned sharply. You were not there. The words came too fast. Too clean. They stepped into the room before Silas could pull them back. Elias held his gaze. No, I was not. Outside, rain softened to a whisper. The cabin waited. Naelli unwrapped the faded cloth fully, and revealed a second thing beneath it, small and dark, folded with care until the creases had nearly become permanent. It was a scrap of blue fabric, smoke-stained at the edges, with 3 stitches of white thread still holding the shape of a tiny flower. Elias knew that flower. Mary had sewn it on the cuff of her kitchen dress after tearing it on a nail. He had teased her for mending what no one would see. She had told him that hidden things deserve care too. He sat down slowly, not because anyone asked him to, but because the past had weight. Naelli placed the fabric beside the bowl. "My mother, Dossela, found Mary beyond the barn wash," she said. The smoke had moved low. Mary could not walk far. Dossela brought water. She brought herbs. She brought the spoon because Mary would not let go of it. Elias stared at the blue cloth until the room blurred at the edges. "Why did nobody tell me?" His voice was not anger now. It was something older. Naelli looked toward the door, toward the wet dark beyond it. "Because my mother was Apache. Because she came to town carrying a white woman's words, and men at the edge of town told her to leave before sunrise. She left the spoon with my grandmother. She kept the rest until someone was willing to hear." Silas let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Convenient story." Then the horses came. Not 3 this time. Many. The sound rose from the valley road in a low, steady rhythm, not a charge, not a rush, but an arrival. Hooves pressed into wet earth. Leather creaked. A horse snorted. Deputy Harlan stepped backward until his shoulder hit the doorframe. Pike lifted the lantern and peered through the rain-dark glass. His face lost color, though not from fear alone. Wonder had its own kind of pale. "Elias," he said quietly, "there are riders on the ridge." Elias stood and moved to the window. Beyond the yard, where the land climbed toward the black line of mesquite, 40 Apache riders waited in the gray rain. They sat their horses without shouting, without weapons raised, without threat in their posture. Stillness made them larger than any noise could have. At their center, an older man dismounted. His hair was streaked with silver, his blanket dark with weather, his bearing straight enough to make every man in the cabin seem suddenly unsure of his own spine. Naelli whispered, "My father." Chief Dossela walked to the porch alone. In both hands he carried a small doeskin pouch, tied with a strip of blue ribbon. He stopped outside the open door and looked first at Naelli, then at Elias, then at Silas Crowley. His voice, when it came, was calm as stone after rain. "We did not come for blood," he said. "We came because a dead woman asked not to be forgotten." Chief Dossela did not step inside until Elias moved aside. That small courtesy changed the room more than any order could have. The sheriff noticed. So did Silas. The old chief entered with rain on his shoulders and the quiet of 40 riders behind him. He placed the doeskin pouch on the table beside the blue cloth, the store token, the bowl of stew, and Mary's burned spoon. For small things. Enough weight to bend a man's whole life around them. Elias stood at one end of the table. Naelli stood at the other. Silas kept near the wall, hands folded, face arranged into patience, but his eyes had begun to search for exits the way guilty men search for kinder weather. Sheriff Pike held the lantern higher. "Chief Dossela," he said, careful with the name. "If you have proof, now would be the time." Taza looked at him for a long moment. Proof is easy to ignore when a town has already chosen its story. No one answered. The chief untied the blue ribbon and opened the pouch. First came a ring, smoke-darkened, warped slightly by heat, but still bright in the places where time had not reached. Elias knew it before it touched the table. Mary's wedding ring. His breath left him without sound. Taza laid it down gently. Then came a folded paper, brown with age, protected in thin oilcloth. "My wife, Dossela, did not write English well," Taza said. But Mary Whitmore spoke. "Dossela wrote what she could. My daughter learned the rest from her mouth." Elias looked at Naelli. Her eyes stayed steady, but there was pain in them now, the pain of carrying someone else's final words across 7 years of mistrust. Taza nodded once, and Naelli began. Mary said the fire did not begin in the kitchen. She smelled lamp oil near the barn. She heard a horse being led away before the flames rose high. She heard a man say your name, Mr. Crowley. Silas gave a soft scoff. A dying woman in smoke can hear anything. Taza did not look at him. She also said the man carried silver store tokens in his coat. One fell in the mud by the barn door. Pike turned toward Silas. "You told me that night you were in town closing the store." Silas's smile thinned. I was. Deputy Harlan spoke before thinking. Store was dark when I rode past. I remember because I needed coffee and figured you had closed early. The words surprised even him. He looked down afterward, as though honesty had stepped on his boot. The cabin held still. Elias picked up Mary's ring, and the metal felt cold despite the warm room. Why? He asked. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Silas looked at the sheriff, then at the chief, then finally at Elias. This is foolishness. Why? Elias repeated. Taza answered instead. Land, water, debt. The same reasons small men make large sorrow. Pike slowly reached for the old note folded in his vest pocket, the one Silas had brought weeks before, claiming Elias still owed against the ranch. His face changed as he looked at it now. The date on this lien, Pike said. It is the week after the fire. Silas turned sharply. Careful, Sheriff. That was the wrong thing to say. Pike's weakness had worn a badge for years, but even weak men know when they are being led by the nose. He folded the lien and put it away. No, Pike said. I reckon I have been careful too long. Elias set Mary's ring beside the bowl. The stew still steamed, patient and warm, while the lie that had frozen his house for 7 years began to thaw in front of everyone. Silas Crowley looked at Sheriff Pike as if the badge had betrayed him by growing a conscience. For 7 years, Silas had lived behind clean windows, polished counters, and a voice soft enough to sell rope as ribbon. Now he stood in Elias Whitmore's kitchen with rain in his coat, 40 Apache riders outside, and Mary's ring lying on the table beside the evidence he thought time had buried. You have no lawful cause to hold me, Silas said. The words were smooth, but the breath under them was not. Pike did not answer at once. He took off his hat, ran one thumb along the brim, and looked at the floorboards as though searching there for the man he should have been years ago. Maybe not yet, he said. But I have cause to ask questions you should have answered a long time back. Silas laughed once. Questions from her. He nodded toward Naelli without looking at her. From them. He flicked his eyes toward the window, toward the still riders on the ridge. That was when the room changed. Not loud, not fast, just enough. Elias saw Pike's jaw settle, saw Deputy Harlan lift his eyes, saw Chief Taza stand a little straighter. Silas had finally said aloud what had been hiding beneath every accusation. He did not fear a false charge. He feared a truth carried by Apache hands. Naelli stepped to the stove and took down another bowl. She filled it with stew, careful and steady, then crossed the room and placed it before Silas. The steam rose between them, rich with sage and pepper. Eat, she said. Silas stared at the bowl. I do not take orders in my own county. It is not an order. Her voice was quiet. It is a chance to sit with the woman you tried to erase. No one moved. Elias looked at the bowl, then at Mary's spoon, then at Silas. You wanted proof she had not poisoned mine, he said. Now prove you are not afraid of hers. Silas's face hardened. This is theater. No, Chief Taza said. Theater is when a man wears respect like a clean shirt and hides rot underneath. Pike looked toward the token again. Sit down, Silas. The name sounded different coming from him now. Less friendly, less owned. Silas did sit, but only because standing had begun to make him look smaller. He picked up the spoon. His hand did not shake much, but enough. The metal touched the stew. He lifted a bite, paused, and lowered it again. Elias watched him lose to a bowl of food. Not because it held danger, because it held memory, because honest hands had made it, because Mary Whitmore had crossed 7 winters to reach this table, and Silas Crowley could not bear to meet her there. Pike saw it too. So did Harlan. So did every silent soul in that room. I will be taking those papers from your office tomorrow, Pike said. The liens, the ledgers, all of them. Silas turned pale around the mouth. You will need a warrant. Then I will get one by sunrise. Elias placed Mary's ring in his palm and closed his fingers around it. He had imagined justice as something hot, loud, and final. Instead, it came like supper cooling on a table, like a sheriff remembering his duty, like an Apache woman standing in a kitchen where hatred said she did not belong. Outside, the rain stopped. On the ridge, 40 riders waited without pride or threat. Inside, Silas Crowley sat before a bowl he could not eat, and the whole room understood why. By sunrise, Mercy Ridge had changed, though the buildings still stood in the same dust, and the same old wind moved through the same crooked streets. Sheriff Pike rode out before breakfast with Deputy Harlan beside him and a warrant folded inside his coat. By noon, Silas Crowley's ledgers were open on the counter of his own store, and names began rising from those pages like bones from shallow ground. False debts, changed dates, ranches leaned on until families broke and moved on. Men who had called him respectable stood outside the Mercantile and stared at their boots. No shots were fired. No grand speech was made. A town can be shamed quieter than it can be saved. 3 days later, Naelli left before the first hard light touched the mesa. Elias woke to a clean kitchen, a banked stove, and the smell of stew warming low in the pot. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed all of it. The rain, the riders, Mary's ring in his palm. But the table told the truth. The burned spoon lay beside a folded piece of cloth, and on that cloth sat one last bowl, covered with a tin plate to keep the heat in. Elias stood there a long while with his hat in his hands. Outside, Chief Taza and the 40 riders were already gone. Their tracks crossed the wet yard and climbed west toward the blue hills, fading where the sun began to dry the earth. Naelli had left no note. She did not need one. Some promises are spoken best by leaving a place better than it was found. Elias carried the bowl and the burned spoon up the small rise behind the cabin, where Mary's grave rested beneath a cottonwood that had survived more winters than seemed fair. The grass was silver with morning dew. Meadowlarks called from the fence line. He knelt slowly, not like a young man, but like a man setting down a weight he had mistaken for himself. He placed the bowl beside the stone, then the spoon. Last, he opened his hand and looked at Mary's ring. For 7 years, he had believed grief was proof of love. Now he understood it was only the part love leaves behind when it has nowhere to go. She found her way home, he said. His voice was rough, but it did not break. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, soft as a woman folding a towel corner under corner. After that morning, Elias Whitmore changed one thing about his house. He fixed the back latch, but he never locked it. Travelers learned over time that smoke often rose from his stovepipe after sundown, and that a bowl could be had by anyone willing to sit honest at his table. Cowboy, widow, trader, orphan, Apache, Navajo, Mexican vaquero, freedman heading west with nothing but a bedroll and hope. Elias asked names, not bloodlines. He measured hunger before he measured trust. Years later, folks still spoke about the night an Apache woman stood in a white cowboy's kitchen and gave him back more than supper. But Elias never told it that way. When asked, he would look toward the stove, where the burned spoon hung above the salt jar, and say only that a home is not proved by who it keeps out. It is proved by who can find warmth